September 15, 1940. Luftwaffe High Command, Berlin. The smell of cigarette smoke and leather filled the briefing room as General Feld Marshal Albert Kesselring reviewed intelligence reports about American aviation fuel. He laughed. Actually laughed. The Americans, in their typical industrial excess, were producing aviation gasoline rated at 100 octane. The Luftwaffe's fighters ran perfectly well on 87-octane B4 fuel, the same fuel that had dominated the skies over Poland, Norway, and France. Typical American waste, one officer reportedly remarked. They build everything twice as big as it needs to be. The numbers seemed to support German confidence. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E, backbone of the Luftwaffe, generated 1,175 horsepower on 87-octane fuel. It had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 2-to-1 against RAF fighters in the early months of the Battle of Britain. German aviation fuel production stood at approximately 175,000 tons per month by late 1940, sufficient for the Luftwaffe's 4,000+ operational aircraft. The synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Politz, and Blechhammer represented years of chemical engineering investment, producing fuel through the Fischer-Tropsch process from coal gasification. Germany had won air superiority over an entire continent with this fuel. Why would anyone need more? American 100-octane fuel was viewed through the lens of industrial extravagance. Intelligence reports noted that the United States was converting its entire aviation fuel production to this higher grade. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's staff calculated that this conversion would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, require retooling of refineries, and consume scarce tetraethyl lead additives. Let the Americans waste their resources, the thinking went. We have quality engineering. They have quantity and excess. But what German intelligence officers failed to understand, what their entire strategic framework couldn't comprehend, was that octane rating wasn't about waste. It was about physics, about thermodynamics, about extracting maximum power from internal combustion engines at altitude where air is thin and every fraction of horsepower matters. Octane rating measures fuel's resistance to detonation under compression. Higher octane fuel allows higher compression ratios and higher manifold pressures without pre-ignition or engine knock. In practical terms, 100-octane fuel allowed Allied engines to run at manifold pressures that would destroy engines running on 87-octane. It allowed superchargers to compress air more aggressively. It allowed pilots to push throttles to emergency war power settings that German pilots could only dream of. The technical specifications told a story German analysts chose to ignore. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, running on 100-octane fuel, produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the power of the Bf 109E's Daimler-Benz DB601A. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, when fed 100-octane instead of 87-octane, jumped from 1,030 horsepower to 1,310 horsepower, a 27% increase from fuel alone. These weren't incremental improvements. These were revolutionary advantages. In September 1940, as Kesselring laughed at American excess, the United States was producing approximately 40,000 barrels per day of 100-octane aviation fuel. By comparison, Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry produced the equivalent of roughly 15,000 barrels per day of all aviation fuels combined. The Americans were outproducing Germany nearly 3:1 in the highest grade aviation fuel, and the war had barely touched American shores. British Air Ministry reports from 1940 documented the difference with clinical precision. Spitfire Mk is, when switched from 87-octane to 100-octane fuel, gained 34 miles per hour in top speed and 6,000 feet in service ceiling. Pilots reported being able to outclimb and outrun Bf 109Es that had previously been competitive opponents. Flight Lieutenant James "Ginger" Lacey, who flew Spitfires throughout the Battle of Britain, later wrote in his diary, "The new fuel changed everything. We could push the throttle through the gate and the Merlin would scream like a banshee. The 109s couldn't follow us in a climb anymore." German test pilots who captured and flew Allied aircraft noted the difference but attributed it to engine design rather than fuel. A Luftwaffe technical report from October 1940, analyzing a captured Hurricane, noted, "The Rolls-Royce Merlin demonstrates excessive manifold pressure capabilities, suggesting either temporary boost for emergency use or inefficient design tolerances." The report never mentioned fuel octane rating. The conceptual framework simply didn't exist. The economic calculation seemed obvious to German planners. Their synthetic fuel plants represented investments of 500 million Reichsmarks or more. The Luna plant alone covered 1,200 acres and employed 35,000 workers. Converting to higher octane production would require complete redesign of catalytic cracking units, addition of alkylation and polymerization facilities, and massive increases in tetraethyl lead production. The cost would be staggering, the disruption to current production catastrophic. What they didn't calculate was the cost of not converting. The cost measured in lost pilots, downed aircraft, failed missions, and ultimately, lost air superiority. By December 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost the Battle of Britain. Official histories would later cite many factors: radar, tactics, pilot fatigue, strategic mistakes. But buried in the statistics was a simpler truth. RAF fighters, running on 100-octane fuel, could climb faster, fly higher, and outrun German fighters when needed. The performance envelope had shifted, and the Luftwaffe didn't understand why. German aviation fuel engineers knew about octane ratings, of course. They weren't ignorant. But their entire industrial and strategic system was optimized for 87-octane production. The synthetic fuel process naturally produced lower-octane gasoline. Upgrading would require American-style petroleum refining capabilities that Germany simply didn't possess. They were locked into their technological choice by industrial path dependency. As 1940 ended, Luftwaffe strength reports showed 2,789 operational aircraft. American aircraft production, still ramping up, had delivered 12,804 aircraft in 1940. And every American fighter and bomber rolling off assembly lines was designed from the ground up to run on 100-octane fuel to extract every possible advantage from that chemical edge. In Berlin, in the smoke-filled briefing rooms of the Luftwaffe High Command, officers continued to analyze tactics, training, and aircraft design. Some discussed the need for better fighters to counter improving Allied aircraft. A few mentioned the possibility of higher-octane fuel research programs. But the laughter had stopped. Something was happening in the skies over England that didn't match the pre-war calculations. Allied fighters were performing beyond their rated specifications. Bombers were flying higher than defensive fighters could effectively intercept. The numbers weren't making sense anymore. What Kesselring and his staff didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that they were watching the beginning of an industrial and chemical revolution in aerial warfare. The Americans weren't being wasteful. They were being ruthlessly, calculatedly, devastatingly efficient. They had identified the single chemical compound that would determine air superiority, and they were producing it in quantities that would soon dwarf Germany's entire fuel industry. The joke was over. The real war was just beginning. And it would be fought not just with aluminum and steel, but with octane and tetraethyl lead, in refineries stretching from Texas to California, producing a fuel that would power the greatest air armada in human history. June 12, 1942. Dieppe, France. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter pilots with 68 confirmed kills, pushed his Focke-Wulf FW-190A-3 into a climbing turn to intercept a formation of RAF Spitfire MKIXs. What happened next, he would later describe in his combat report as impossible according to all technical specifications. The Spitfires, which should have been inferior in climb rate to his FW-190, matched his climb, then exceeded it. Priller, flying one of Germany's newest and most powerful fighters, watched in disbelief as the British fighters pulled away vertically, their Merlin engines screaming at manifold pressures that should have torn the engines apart. His FW-190, rated at 1,700 horsepower, was being outperformed by aircraft he had studied, whose published specifications showed lower power output. "They climbed like rockets," Priller wrote that evening. "Either the British have developed entirely new engines, or our intelligence about their aircraft is catastrophically wrong." The intelligence wasn't wrong about the aircraft. It was wrong about the fuel. By mid-1942, the performance gap had become undeniable. American P-38 Lightnings, powered by two Allison V-1710 engines running on 100-octane fuel, were achieving speeds of 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than any production German fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt, just entering service, weighed 17,500 pounds fully loaded but could still climb at 2,780 feet per minute, powered by a single Pratt & Whitney R-2800 generating 2,535 horsepower on 100/130 octane fuel. German test facilities at Rechlin began systematic testing of captured Allied aircraft in early 1942. The results were confusing, then alarming, then terrifying. A captured P-40 Warhawk, when flown with its original American fuel, achieved performance that matched pilot reports. When flown with German 87-octane B-4 fuel, its performance degraded by approximately 18%. Maximum speed dropped from 362 miles per hour to 297 miles per hour. Rate of climb fell from 2,100 feet per minute to 1,650 feet per minute. Service ceiling decreased from 29,000 feet to 23,500 feet. The same aircraft. The only variable was fuel. Oberst Edgar Peterson, director of the Luftwaffe Test Center at Rechlin, submitted a priority report to the RLM, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Reich Aviation Ministry, on August 3, 1942. The report, classified Geheime Kommandosake, secret command matter, stated, "Testing confirms that Allied aviation fuel provides performance advantages of 15 to 25% across all parameters. Enemy aircraft are not superior by design but by fuel chemistry. Immediate investigation of high-octane fuel production is recommended." The report landed on desks in Berlin where economic realities outweighed technical recommendations. Germany's synthetic fuel industry was already operating at maximum capacity, producing approximately 5.7 million tons of fuel in 1942. Converting even a fraction of this production to higher octane fuel would require complete redesign of catalytic cracking units at 11 major plants, installation of alkylation facilities requiring platinum catalysts, which Germany imported and couldn't spare, tripling of tetraethyl lead production from 2,500 tons per year to 7,500 tons estimated cost. 800 million Reichsmarks estimated production disruption, 18 to 24 months. Estimated reduction in total fuel volume during transition, 30%. The numbers were impossible. Germany was already struggling to meet fuel demands for its mechanized army, its U-boat fleet, and the Luftwaffe. A 2-year transition period with 30% reduced production would cripple military operations. The decision-makers faced an impossible choice: continue with inferior fuel and accept performance disadvantages, or shut down fuel production for retooling and lose the war immediately. They chose to continue with 87 octane. Meanwhile, American production of 100-octane fuel was exploding. From 40,000 barrels per day in September 1940, production had reached 180,000 barrels per day by June 1942, a 450% increase in 21 months. New refineries at Baytown, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Wilmington, California were coming online with dedicated 100-octane production facilities. The Humble Oil Refinery in Baytown alone could produce more 100-octane fuel than Germany's entire aviation fuel industry. Combat reports from the Eastern Front told the same story. On July 28, 1942, Major Erich Hartmann engaged a formation of Soviet La-5 fighters over Stalingrad. The La-5, powered by a Shvetsov Ash-82 radial engine, was running on American 100-octane fuel delivered through the Lend-Lease program. Hartmann, flying a Bf-109G-2, found himself unable to catch the Soviet fighters in level flight. They had at least 40 km/h speed advantage, he reported. This is a new aircraft variant or new equipment we have not encountered before. It wasn't a new aircraft. It was the same La-5. The fuel was different. By late 1942, Luftwaffe intelligence had collected enough data to understand the scope of the problem. A comprehensive report compiled in November 1942 analyzed captured fuel samples, performance data, and production estimates. The conclusions were devastating. United States 100-octane production, 190,000 barrels per day, approximately 27,500 tons per day. British 100-octane production, 35,000 barrels per day, approximately 5,000 tons per day. Combined Allied production, 225,000 barrels per day, 32,500 tons per day, or approximately 11.9 million tons per year. German aviation fuel production, all grades 5.7 million tons per year. Allied high-octane fuel production exceeded total German aviation fuel production by more than 2:1. The performance advantages were quantified with brutal precision. P-51 Mustang with 100 octane, 437 miles per hour maximum speed, 41,900 feet service ceiling. Hypothetical P-51 with 87 octane, 361 miles per hour maximum speed, 34,000 feet service ceiling. Performance advantage, 21% speed, 23% altitude. Spitfire Mk9 with 100 octane, 408 miles per hour, 43,000 feet. Hypothetical Spitfire with 87 octane, 339 miles per hour, 35,500 feet. Performance advantage, 20% speed, 21% altitude. FW-190A-4 with 87 octane, 408 miles per hour, 37,400 feet. Hypothetical FW-190 with 100 octane, 489 miles per hour, 45,000 feet. This calculation existed only on paper. Germany couldn't produce the fuel. The chemistry was simple. The consequences were profound. Higher octane fuel allowed engines to run at higher compression ratios and manifold pressures without detonation. This meant more air and fuel could be forced into cylinders, generating more power. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, running on 100 octane, operated at plus 18 psi manifold pressure boost. The same engine on 87 octane would detonate and destroy itself at anything above plus 9 psi. German engines were designed around 87 octane fuel limitations. The Daimler-Benz DB605 in the Bf-109G operated at plus 1.42 ATA manifold pressure, approximately plus 6 psi boost. Allied engines routinely operated at plus 15 to plus 25 psi boost. The power difference was proportional to the pressure difference. Luftwaffe pilots developed tactics to compensate. They relied on superior training, tactical discipline, and careful energy management. They avoided prolonged dogfights where sustained power output mattered. They used dive and climb tactics that played to their aircraft's strengths. They became extraordinarily skilled at fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. But skill has limits. In November 1942, American P-38 Lightnings escorted B-17 bombers to Lille, France. Luftwaffe Bf-109GS intercepted at 27,000 feet. The P-38s, each powered by two Allison engines generating 1,600 horsepower on 100/130 octane fuel, simply climbed away from the German fighters. The Bf-109s, already at 85% maximum power to maintain altitude, couldn't follow. The bombers flew on, unmolested. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, commander of JG-77, wrote in his diary, "We are fighting with courage and skill, but we are fighting with our engines restricted by an invisible throttle. The Americans pushed their engines to limits that would melt our pistons. This is not a fair fight. This is not even the same war." The economic analysis became darker. To match American 100-octane production, Germany would need to build 47 new synthetic fuel plants the size of Luna, each requiring 35,000 workers, 1,200 acres, and investments of 500 million Reichsmarks. Total cost, 23.5 billion Reichsmarks. Total construction time, 6 to 8 years. Total workers required, 1.6 million. Germany didn't have the money, the time, the land, or the workers. More critically, even if it had started construction in 1939, the plants wouldn't be operational until 1945 to 1947. The war would be over. The Americans, meanwhile, were expanding production. New refineries were under construction in 1942 that would bring total capacity to 350,000 barrels per day by 1944, enough to fuel every Allied aircraft in operation with surplus capacity remaining. In December 1942, General Feld Marshal Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, received the comprehensive fuel analysis. He read it twice, then placed it in his safe. The implications were too dangerous to share widely. Germany had lost the air war before most of the decisive battles had even been fought. Not because of tactics or courage or aircraft design. Because of chemistry. Because of industrial capacity. Because of a decision made years earlier to optimize for synthetic fuel production from coal rather than high-octane fuel from petroleum. Because the Americans had identified the chemical compound that would determine air superiority and had bet their entire aviation industry on it. The gap was unbridgeable. The war had already been decided. The rest was just mathematics playing out at 25,000 feet, written in contrails and falling aircraft.